The federal government has been moving forward on political promises and policy changes, from childcare deals.
Canadian families from coast to coast to coast will benefit from quality, early learning, accessible, affordable childcare, which is a historic moment.
To procurement changes.
It is the most significant investment in the RCAF in more than 30 years.
There was also last week's historic deal with the NDP, which will see dental care becoming a reality, more commitments on reconciliation, and this week, Ottawa unveiled its new climate plan to reach its emission targets. So how do these announcements fit into the government and the Prime Minister's political legacy? Are these policies here to stay? It's Thursday. I'm here with That Issue, Chantal Hebert, Althia and Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Andrew is away this week. Chantal, I'll start with you. I realize that it is just a coincidence that all these things happened in the past week or so, but it does start to make you think about some of the significance of the things that the Prime Minister has done and whether there is a reflection about putting things in place that will sort of define his government and his work.
A coincidence maybe, but the gift of the pact with the NDP, if it endures as a promised, is the gift of time. And what time does is it makes it harder to kill policies, to go back on them. Take childcare. In 3 years, is any sound looking to win Conservative Party going to campaign telling parents they're going to go back to sending them a check and they're going to dismantle something that a majority of premiers who are not liberal signed off on?
Yeah.
That would be easier, or would have been easier to do in 6 to 18 months, I think, at this time next year. Otherwise, we would have been talking about when is the election, will they survive the budget? Take climate change. We don't know what the environment will be like in 3 years, but it possibly will be more friendly to the cost associated with climate change mitigation than they would be in 6 to 12 months when inflation is on the rampage. So, yes, bottom line, I don't know if these are coincidences, but I do know that if they'd been announced without that pact, the Liberals would again have to campaign on them probably a year from now.
That's interesting because the childcare deal, I agree, it seems like it would be hard to undo, Althia, but climate change seems to still be a very political hot conversation, including obviously the carbon tax. So does that mean in 3 years from now that too becomes difficult to undo, as Chantal's suggesting?
Well, the Liberals have announced that they want to enshrine the price escalator to try to prevent a likely Conservative government from going back on that pledge. They're wrapping their arguments around investors looking for certainty, and that's true. But Chantal is right. I mean, that NDP Liberal arrangement is basically designed to ensure that you have programs that are all in place before you go back to the polls, whether that's childcare or dental care, possibly pharmacare. And so people are used to them, and you're taking something away rather than giving something to people, if that's what happens. I think, yes, to your question about the legacy with regards to the Prime Minister, I think, you hearken back to 2015, Justin Trudeau kept talking about reducing income inequality. These are programs that could help you get there. He was very, or so he says, insulted during the last election campaign when the NDP kept accusing him of doing nothing when it came to social programs and the environment. He said, you can attack me for perhaps not doing enough, but you can't say I've done nothing. In some ways, both parties are trying to get a win here. Mm-hmm. I think the question, though, is that this is, again, the Liberals' ideology of keeping all the purse strings federally, imposing national standards. Some provinces won't mind that because I think it helps them. I think about negotiations with bargaining units, for example. When Ottawa dictates where the money goes, it's a lot harder to feel pressure to take part of that budget and give it in higher salaries, for example. But that is a fundamental reshifting, and that risks perhaps some programs viability in the long run. Will provinces want to continue funding something if a future federal government doesn't want to kick in its part of the bargain?
Well, it's sort of, does it change, as our colleague Susan Delacourt wrote this week, does it sort of change the social fabric of the country in a really fundamental way? These things that we've seen this week, reconciliation, obviously a piece of that, that the government continues to push forward, but childcare, pharmacare, all these things that have yet to come as well, Elamin.
One thing that I'm really struck by is just like how much the Liberal government appears to be in control of the narrative that they're trying to tell right now. And that's because things have just like shifted so rapidly just in the last month and a half. I mean, it was just 6 weeks ago that we were talking about the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa and a government that has been, quite besieged. And now we're talking about this coincidental timing, and everything is kind of falling into place to tell a pretty coherent story leading up to that budget. I think it does change the sort of idea that Canadians have of their basic expectation of the social safety net. I mean, introducing dental care into that is something that is going to be very difficult to revoke. Introducing pharmacare into that is going to be something that's very difficult to revoke. And of course, we have a budget that's coming up a week from now. And as we head towards that budget, oil prices are high. It's going to allow them to tell a pretty coherent and positive story, I think, about the deficit that they may have been worried about before. And so it's just like really striking to me how in just about 6 weeks' time, the Liberals have appeared to entirely shifted their position.
Chantal. Yep.
But you do understand that it means that the candidates who are vying for the Conservative leadership today can say things that they won't need to be saying in 3 years. Which is different from what happened to Erin O'Toole, who was elected as Conservative leader and then went almost straight away into an election campaign. And he had a hard time, rightly so, divorcing himself for what he'd said in the campaign and what was happening. None of us have a clue what the environment will be like in 3 years. The Liberals don't know, the Conservatives don't know. But time does allow whoever becomes the next Conservative leader to craft different policies from the ones that he or she campaigns on in this campaign, without looking like Erin O'Toole looked, like he had said one thing and 6 months later was saying something else. So there are opportunities there, not just for the Liberals or the NDP.
Well, there's also probably, Conservatives that I've spoken to, Althia, concern about how Canadians respond to the notion of small government now, given how much government they've been experiencing through the pandemic. And what we saw this week was, furthering that. So I don't know how that also shapes the conversation.
Yeah, I'd say two things. On the potential Conservative leader being able to pivot in a way that Erin O'Toole wasn't able to do. Yes, but no. I mean, there are some people who will not be able to do that pivot. Like I think of Pierre Poilievre, for example, or Roman Baber, who have defined their identity on campaigning against a price on carbon, for example. I cannot see them, arguing to their own constituencies that suddenly things have changed and now they're in favor of it. With regards to the kind of the Conservatives, the smaller government argument, I think people will want to know how the government, any government, intends to pay for all these programs.
Yes, for sure.
And so I do think that, ensuring that the program's viability, that you're not running structural deficits, I think, that is a message that can resonate with people far beyond just people on the center right.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say about what we've seen in the last few weeks is that the Liberals have really, and you could argue both sides of this, but I'm going to argue one of them, have chosen policy over politics. They could have decided for partisan reasons to help the Ontario Liberals and not announce a childcare deal until after the Ontario election in June. And they decided not to. I mean, to the chagrin, I think, of a lot of Ontario Liberals. And so in some ways, you have to give the government credit that they are doing things that are going to help people faster in spite of the politics playing against people in their own party.
Elamin.
I think one thing that has been really striking to me about the way that Liberals have been talking about the childcare deal, especially in Ontario, has been about this has been the missing piece in terms of, here's this socially transformative program. What I'm really curious about is how that shakes out in the budget, because as we've seen sort of when the budgets come out, we see how that is stacked up against other programs. We've sort of seen, for example, the Liberals talk about the F-35 acquisitions this week. I think that's going to be interesting in terms of how much that costs, because I think if you're the NDP, you're going to be looking at how much each of these pledges is going to get in the budget and what that says about its importance. And so I can't, as much as these programs are significant, I don't want to rush into saying that they will be accepted and beloved immediately, because they will be measured against what other priorities this government is going to put forward.
Sure, and their success as well, obviously. Yes. Chantal has things to say.
Well, there has been money budgeted for the childcare program on the basis of which all those agreements were signed. So that is that. But as for whoever is campaigning now for the Conservatives pivoting, I'm old enough to remember Jean Chrétien campaigning to eliminate the GST and renegotiate NAFTA. Neither of those things got done. And they were major signature promises. So my faith in the capacity to pivot of any federal leader is endless.
Is that another way of saying lie?
I didn't say that.
No, adapt. Adapt. Yeah.
Adapt.
Yeah, adapt.
To 3 months ago versus now.
Yeah, that's right. I always walk away from these remembering what you all agree on, and that is that people will forgive many things if they think they're going to win. So that's the one takeaway I always have from this panel, and that's what I would say back to that as well. Okay, let's move on to one more round. We're going to look ahead more to next week's budget, this time next week, and find out what everybody is looking for. Chantal, Althia, and Elamin. Elamin, you were talking the most about the budget in the first part, so I'm going to make you start on this one. I mean, we know it's going to pass ostensibly. You wouldn't think this deal would fall apart the first time out. But I wonder what else it has to sort of telegraph or suggest from the government in terms of its intention on economic growth or other issues that might be important here.
I mean, I think there's real comfort in the idea that it's going to pass for the Liberals, but there is worry, I think, in that for the NDP, because if you are an NDP supporter, you are looking at this budget closely to say, what did we do this deal for? As a party, if we're willing to give away our biggest bargaining chip, which is maybe sometimes we won't support the Liberals, what concrete sort of movement towards some of these programs that have been promised will be in this budget? And so I assume we're going to see some concrete starts to pharmacare, to dental care. And if you don't see that, I think the NDP would have every right to say, okay, we're in trouble because we promised to support 4 budgets, and the idea of letting one go without getting anything, getting the beginning of anything that we want, would spell trouble to this tenuous marriage.
Yeah, I agree. You would expect them to get something, at least the first time out. I wonder, Althia, how much you would also expect the government to address some of the things you were talking about, sort of whether there are any fiscal guardrails left, or whether the government has any concerns about spending at all, and whether there's any appetite to rein things in at some point.
Yeah, whether they maintain that declining debt to GDP ratio that they promised was their new benchmark for financial prudence, if I could use that word generously, I guess. I think the main thing that so many will be watching is how the government intends to pay for everything. So dental care, which is supposed to be, according to the NDP Liberal arrangement, in place for kids under 12 by the end of this calendar year, that's a significant chunk of change. Where is the money going to come to pay for this? I mean, we'll remember that the Liberals were running structural deficits even before COVID. So they were already in a dark hole. How are they planning to, inch their way out of it? Clearly, we're not looking for, a plan to balance budgets anymore down the line. But I do think that is something that they do need to pay attention to, because they are very vulnerable on that front.
Chantal.
Okay, so the good news for the Liberals, some provinces actually have dental care programs for kids. Mine does. So that goes some way, for one. And the pharmacare issue, you can't put a lot of money forward without provincial buy-in. And that's been missing for the past 3 years. So it's not going to materialize by next Thursday.
Can I ask
It's not just the NDP that needs to reassure its members and some of its voters. It's also the Liberals and the Blue Liberals who are quite, actually, I think, more disquieted by this deal than any NDP member, because they're thinking that the fiscal responsibility brand that Paul Martin built is just being thrown out the window. So they're going to be looking for the guardrails that Althia talks about. As for the NDP, yes, for sure, it wants to see things in the budget. But seriously, we're talking here about the honeymoon phase of an engagement. And usually trouble starts later.
That's true. I mean, there are always exceptions to that rule, but generally. Althia, you wanted to say one more thing.
I think one thing that New Democrats are going to be watching for is there like a poison pill in this budget? Is there something that otherwise they would have been hesitant to support the Liberals with if they didn't have this arrangement? I think they'll be watching closely for, what have we signed up for? Yeah. So that's something else. I mean, the other thing is, to your point earlier, like there's no drama, right? Like the Bloc Québécois had a press conference on Thursday morning with their list of asks. Well, it doesn't matter what they ask because there's no negotiating power anymore. Yeah. So things have shifted in Ottawa.
Yeah, they have dramatically, but we're still going to enjoy covering the budget next Thursday. We really, really will.
Or not.
Okay, Chantal, Althia, and Elamin. I'll see you next week. Thank you.
You bet.